So here we're going to take a look at some of the basic terms and some of the basic ideas associated with prokaryotic metabolism. And so hopefully if you take a peek at this video before class, when we start talking a little bit more about the details of prokaryotic metabolism and we start using some of these terms, you'll feel comfortable with it. So one way of kind of defining metabolism is it's basically all of the chemical reactions happening inside of a cell that are required to keep that cell alive. And so if you think of what does a cell really need in order to stay alive, it needs a few things. So a cell basically needs two things to stay alive. It actually needs more than two things, but we'll kind of highlight two really important things that a cell needs in order to stay alive. One thing that's absolutely required to stay alive is access to some molecule that has carbons in it. And so if you're wondering, well, how come it's so important to have a molecule that has carbons in it? Well, if you consider the typical structure of a cell, and here's a bacterial cell, if you think of all of the structures that make up that cell, virtually everything in there has carbon in it. So you need carbon to basically build all of the parts of a cell. So for example, nitrogenous bases, which are used to make DNA and RNA, check it out. Nitrogenous bases have carbons in them. Lipids, which is a major component of the cell membrane, check out all those carbons that lipids contain. And amino acids, which are used to make proteins, which make up a whole bunch of different structures in a cell, check it out. Amino acids have carbons in it. So again, if you're asking why is carbon so important in order for a cell to stay alive? Well, look, carbons are needed to basically build everything that you find inside of a cell. Right, so one thing that's absolutely essential for a cell to have in order to stay alive is a carbon source. Right, carbon's used to build basically everything in the cell. Another thing that's required in order to stay alive is energy, right? It takes energy, for example, to build all of these structures inside of a cell. It requires energy for a cell to replicate and to do all the other work that a cell needs to do. And so you might remember from another class that the molecule that cells can use directly in order to power all of its processes is ATP. And typically, in order to produce ATP, what a cell requires is, well, it needs to ingest some other molecule that has energy to it. And so what happens is that after the cell ingests this molecule, it breaks it down in order to release energy that can then be used to make something else that has a lot of energy, which is ATP. Right, so besides carbon source, another really important thing that a cell needs in order to stay alive is some sort of energy source that can be used to make ATP. All right, so kind of another way to think about all of this here is that, well, there's essentially two different types of metabolic reactions. Right, so as we saw here, there's a type of metabolic reaction that involves building things. Right, so all of these important parts of the cells need to be built first. And so if you're talking about a type of metabolic reaction that involves building things, that's referred to as, and so there's two general types of metabolic reactions. The building type of reaction are referred to anabolic reactions. And again, anabolic means, and another term for anabolic reaction, you might also see biosynthetic reaction, but they both mean the same thing. It just means building something. And so I always kind of think of anabolic steroids, building up muscles. Right? So anabolic, that term anabolic refers to building stuff up, making things bigger. Another general class of metabolic reaction, and an example of that is here, involves breaking things down. So for example, this energy molecule is broken down in order to release energy that can be used to make ATP. So if you're talking about a type of metabolic reaction that involves breaking something down, you might remember from another class that that's referred to as a catabolic reaction. Again, breaking stuff down is what that means. It turns out that different types of bacteria, and more general, different types of cells can use different kinds of molecules as their carbon source. And there's some variety as far as what cells can use as energy sources too. And so what we'll do is spell that out. Right? So first, if we consider just what can cells use as a carbon source? Right? So you can classify cells based on that. And so to see how that's done, how about if we first take a peek at maybe what you're most familiar with? So what can human beings use as carbon sources? And so if you think about, well, what do you need to do every day in order to stay alive? Well, one of the things you need to do is eat. And the types of things you can eat include stuff like this. So vegetables and fruits and meat, which all contain organic molecules. Right? So all the things you can eat, basically the only things you can eat are organic molecules. And examples of organic molecules include things like proteins and sugars and lipids. And so that would make sense that we could get our carbon through these things because these things are chock full of carbons. It turns out that if you compare how we get our carbons to the way that prokaryotes get their carbons, prokaryotes are more diverse in their metabolism. So it turns out that there are some prokaryotes that, like us, they get their carbons through taking in proteins and sugars and lipids, or just organic molecules. But there are some prokaryotes that can do something that we can't. Right? So it turns out that there are some prokaryotes that can obtain their carbon by just sitting there and absorbing the CO2 in the atmosphere. Right? CO2 has carbon in it, and so there are prokaryotes that can use the carbon in CO2 in order to build all the structures inside of the cell. So we said that you can categorize cells based on what they use as carbon sources, and so let's kind of throw out those terms here. So if you're talking about a cell that can basically just feed itself by sitting there and just absorbing the CO2 in the atmosphere, the term used to describe that type of organism is autotroph. Right? So there are cells that can use CO2 as their carbon source. Those cells are referred to as autotrophs, or self-feeders. And the definition for autotroph is that, well, it's a cell that gets its carbon from CO2, right, from the CO2 in the atmosphere. We also showed you that there's cells that get their carbon by taking in organic molecules like proteins and sugars and lipids. So kind of the alternative to an autotroph, if you're not getting your carbon from CO2, then you're getting it from organic molecules. And the term used to describe that type of cell is heterotroph. Right? So heterotroph is a cell that gets its carbon from organic molecules. Right? So carbon is an important thing. Cells need access to it in order to live. You can categorize how they get their carbon by saying that they're either autotrophic or heterotrophic. All right, so kind of back to this here. So another thing besides carbon we mentioned that cells absolutely need in order to stay alive is some sort of energy source. And we'll see that there's many different things that different cells can use as an energy source, and you can categorize them accordingly. So before we see how we can categorize cells based on what they use as an energy source, I think it'll first help to know a little bit something about how energy sources are used to make ATP. Right? So just the basics of how, the basic of how ATP is produced. We'll show you that first. Right, so we'll focus in on energy source right now. And so basically what happens, or what has to happen in order for a cell to generate ATP? Well, you know that ATP, it's a high energy molecule. And so in order to make a high energy molecule, high energy just doesn't appear out of nowhere. You have to have access to something else with high energy and use that in order to make this ATP, which also has high energy. And so the way the cell does that is that it uses this idea. So if you were to think of energy and boil it down to its essence, basically all energy is movement. Right? So I kind of think like the Energizer Bunny represents a battery. Battery represents energy. The Energizer Bunny is always moving. So if you were to boil it all down, all energy is movement of something. And so in order for a cell to generate ATP, it has to generate something that moves. Right? Because when that thing moves, it represents energy that can then be used to make the ATP. And so the specific thing that a cell makes move in order to generate ATP